America's workforce. Its strength is our nation's success. Join Ronnie Spellman on I Build America podcast as we explore innovative solutions and inspiring stories from leaders and workers shaping America. Discover actionable insights to build a motivated workforce.
Welcome to I Build America podcast. This is Ronnie Spellman, and we have a wonderful guest. The whole premise behind the I Build America podcast is to really create a conversation around the workforce development industry, to address the challenges, outline successes in the workforce industry that will help ensure that businesses, industries, and workers can optimize their success. So I'm really excited to have a wonderful leader who understands these segments and industries well, someone who understands business, who understands policy, who understands how to create opportunities for communities around the country. Wes Jurey. Wes, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Now, you're managing partner of the South Dallas Employment Project. You're also CEO of Redemption Bridge. But your experience spans beyond Dallas. It expands beyond Texas. It even expands beyond the United States of America into other countries. But I want to read your biography, your background, because I think it's so important for people to understand your history and what you've done. You're absolutely amazing. You're amazing in multiple categories, both, as I mentioned, in business, but also workforce development. So for those people listening to the program, you have to really understand his background and give context to his message to us. But Redemption Bridge is a nonprofit intermediary focused on establishing new models for workforce development. So you're key. He is also the founder, president, CEO of the Agricultural Technology Innovation Partnership Foundation, affiliated with the United States Department of Agriculture, senior advisor to the Manufacturing Skills Standards Council. You established the Center for Continuing Education and Workforce Development in 2004, which was selected as one of 12 sites nationally for the Workforce Innovation Networks Initiative, a project of the Ford Foundation and the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor. You built in partnership also with the University of Texas at Arlington, the City of Arlington, Tarrant County Workforce Investment Board. The facility fostered partnerships with virtually every major education and workforce development stakeholder in Tarrant County, which is in Texas. You were also appointed to the non-member U.S. Department of Labor panel in 2002, charged with the developing of the department's five-year strategic research plan. Labor Secretary Elaine Chao appointed you to the Department of Labor's Advisory Committee on Apprenticeships 2008, and you were reappointed by the Labor Secretary Hilda Solis in 2010. Wes, you've worked with several presidential administrations, the U.S. Department of Labor. You worked at the Chamber of Commerce as the CEO for the Arlington Chamber of Commerce and the El Paso Chamber of Commerce. What you've done in business and workforce is just, as I mentioned earlier, absolutely incredible. So I'm so excited to have you on I Build America as we explore ways to do what you've already done over several decades. But tell us from your viewpoint what you've done in those two spaces, business and in workforce development.
Well, it really comes down to one single word: collaboration. In the truest sense. I know when I was in El Paso in the late 80s, I was the Boy Scout executive, and there came a point in time when the business leaders I'd recruited to the Boy Scout board came to me and said, we've tried for a year to merge 5 economic development entities in El Paso into one, and the mayor and county judge have said they will support it as a public-private partnership, and we're not getting there, and we'd like you to leave the Boy Scouts and come and put this new Chamber of Commerce together. I remember saying, I don't know what a Chamber of Commerce does. They said, you'll fit in. The staffs don't know what they're doing either. And I ultimately agreed to take that position. But it was really collaboration. It was bringing 5 nonprofits and a city and a county together to establish the new organization. And then it was hiring Stanford Research Institute and DRI McGraw-Hill to come in and lead a planning effort to really look at the economy, what it was, what it wasn't, what it could be. And that meant bringing together about 80 organizations in that community, all the standard ones you think of, the city, the county, university, school districts, community college, workforce board, Fort Bliss, and others. But it was the non-traditional ones at the time. This was in very, very early 90s, MALDEF, LULAC, NAACP, communities, groups, labor unions. And they all attended a monthly meeting to hear the report from SRI and DRI, and that was critical to their buy-in because they heard it directly. And by the time we concluded that, the community had come together and agreed on the path forward.
It's amazing. Tell me this, though. So for those listening that were like you before you joined the chamber, what is a chamber and why is that important to workforce development? I know we'll get through some of the other areas that you use in combining 5 different chambers into one. But for those new to the premise of what a chamber, both business leaders, I'm finding that a lot of business leaders have no idea what a chamber of commerce is. I had the CEO of a chamber of commerce on a different program recently, and I implore business leaders listening, join the chamber because there's so many resources they can help with policy and your growth and helping manage you. But tell the listener what a chamber of commerce is.
Well, what it should be is the collective will of the business community to partner with public and private sector interests to build the economic viability of a community.
Right.
Not all chambers do that. Some are known for ribbon cuttings and networking events. Right. But at the heart of an economic development effort is to understand that 3 things happen in a region, and only 3. You generate wealth, you recirculate the wealth, or you watch it migrate to another community.
True.
One of my earliest mentors said, do 1 and 2, avoid 3 as much as possible.
Right.
But you really think about something as simple as manufacturing. I live in Arlington, work in Dallas, but I'm next to one of the biggest General Motors plants in North America, and every day SUVs come out of that assembly line and they're sold for more than the cost of production. Now, what happened? You just generated wealth. Where's the wealth going? Well, some of it goes to the city and the county in taxes. Right. Some goes to the people who work there in terms of salaries. But a lot of it goes to buy the parts, components, supplies, and services needed. And at this General Motors plant, over 600 separate parts go into just the dashboard assembly alone.
Wow.
Meaning over 600 companies receive payment for one of those parts. And where are those companies? Well, if those companies are in this North Central Texas region, we're recirculating the wealth. But if most of those companies are external to other regions, we're watching the wealth migrate as quickly as it is created. And so you've got to build the wealth-generating companies by supporting them with their suppliers and service providers. And then there are 5 foundations that have to be in place, because those companies all need access to capital. They need access to the infrastructure needed to move people, product, or information to and from. They need access to public policies that support and enable rather than inhibit. But what they really need is a skilled, trained workforce for that particular industry cluster.
Right.
I knew all the time I served as chairman of the state system, the director of the governor's office of economic development told me that every company that they've talked to about coming to Texas first said, tell me about your workforce. Where in the state can I find the skilled, trained workers I'm going to need for my particular business?
I agree. Yeah, I moved an office from Wisconsin some years ago to Texas, and we conducted a national search for a location. And you're right. We were looking for all of those elements who had great high school programs or K through 12 programs, not just for our employees to put their kids, but from a workforce perspective, who had great colleges, and what jobs and infrastructure was in place in the community to support our business. Can we find employees? Can we find the support from policymakers to support what we're doing and growing? So you're absolutely right from a workforce development. In every community I moved to and moved a business to or opened an office, my first connection was with the Chamber of Commerce. And they opened the doors for me to meet other business leaders that we need to meet, other policy leaders that we needed to meet. So you're absolutely right on. And what you did in El Paso, you merged 5 different chambers of commerce. And then you merged another set of departments as well on the economic development side, right?
Well, it's hard to have 7 chiefs, so to speak. But we actually merged an industrial development corporation, a minority business enterprise development corporation, a community development corporation, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Business Committee for the Arts into one.
Right.
Because that brought the business community together with a united voice, but it also brought the city and the county and the educational community and others together. Because if Chamber's truly going to lead economic development, it has to be a good partner, or it has to be a good collaborator. Because if you think about what we just said, chambers don't set policy. City and county officials do, right? Chambers don't build the infrastructure. City and counties do. Chambers don't create the workforce. Public ed, higher ed, and workforce boards create and fund the workforce development needed in a community. Chambers don't create access to capital. The financial services community does. you have to bring those elements together in a collaborative manner and collectively agree on what are you going to build within your community,
right,
and what's your community going to be based on, so that you've got viable, sustainable industry clusters, which are the wealth generators in any community.
Right. And you mentioned this earlier as we were opening, the idea of partnerships is incredible. So you just laid out what partnerships look like. I think sometimes in some communities, they think they can do everything maybe in one house, but you need to have all the stakeholders in place. And you did that, and you turned El Paso around from a community standpoint. But talk about the report that you received from SRI and one of your major industries that was leaving, and how you went about it addressing that. I thought that was just incredible. At that time, there were so many industries leaving the United States and going abroad.
Well, the garment industry was long centered in El Paso. Levi Strauss, Farah, Acme Boots, they were all there.
Right.
And with our first report out from the Stanford Research Institute, DRI McGraw-Hill group we hired, they said, do you want the good or bad news first? And I have 80 people in the room from the mayor on. And I turned to the mayor and said, you pick. He said, all right, I want the good news first. Right. And they said, fine, Mr. Mayor, you're number one in America at something. He said, what's that? And they said, lowest median wage. And his smile disappeared. And he said, that is not good news.
Right.
They said, well, if you want to be the low-wage capital of the U.S., it is. But if that's not what you want in your future, stay tuned, stay with us. We think we know some industry clusters you can build, because your garment industry is gone. You've got 28,000 jobs, 12% of the county's workforce, and they will all be in Asia in 4 years.
Wow.
And the reason is simple. The prevailing wage rate being paid in El Paso at the time was $13 an hour. The prevailing wage rate in Asia at the time was 50 cents an hour. And they said something very simple. You cannot stay in business paying 26 times the wage rate of your competitor. So you need to stay tuned with us, and we think we can help you rebuild some new industry clusters that will grow and sustain your community for years to come.
And then so many of our industries had a similar challenge, and that the wage of foreign countries really made it more rational for our businesses to move abroad. And the question became, how do you sustain the American economy? And so it sounds like you figured out some ways in El Paso to reverse that decline in opportunities for you. Were losing a lot of jobs. I forget the numbers that you mentioned to me now, but you were losing thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs.
Well, in that decade, we did lose the 28,000 jobs in the garment industry, but we had a net gain of about 40,000 jobs overall, which meant we created close to 70,000 new jobs in that decade. But let's go back to my comment. You generate wealth, you recirculate it by bringing the suppliers and service providers together, or you see it migrate.
Right.
We got from that report the fact that we were losing $6 billion a year in outsourcing. Companies in El Paso were buying goods, services, parts, components from companies external to our market, but we got a detailed report on why and how. For example, we had 27 companies doing plastic injection molding, but they were all buying those bags of plastic pellets you melt in your mold machine from a company 500 some miles away.
Okay.
And they did that because there wasn't a company in El Paso selling plastic pellets. We found that we could call companies that did that and say, if I can give you $106 million a year in gross revenue, would you consider coming to El Paso? And believe it or not, they would. And then we found that that was $3 billion of our $6 billion was we didn't have a company selling that in El Paso.
That is interesting.
Then we got a list of the $3 billion that was outsourced where we did have sources in El Paso. And I found that if I went to companies to say, if I can find for you local sources that will sell to you at a competitive price, would you consider buying locally, not internationally, so to speak? And they said, sure, we don't have time to go out and find those sources, but if you find them for us, we'll talk about it. And I found I could find a company in El Paso that had a 100-ton press to do metal stamping, and Delco Ramey gave them a $4 million a year contract to do their metal stamping instead of sending it externally.
That is amazing. So I headed up a supply chain operation, and in the supply chain, there are just so many parts and pieces and components, like you mentioned, just 600 on the dashboard alone for the auto industry. And if you can bring that into your local community, then you reduce on the shipping costs and some other costs, and you make it more readily available within the community versus having to be impacted by external factors, whether it's shipping across the sea or et cetera. So what you did seemed to be brilliant, and you probably thought it made good common sense. But there are a lot of communities, and it is, but a lot of communities, they don't think about that innovative approach, what sounds like an innovative approach, in trying to bring something regional so you can keep the money in the community. You're creating jobs, you're creating workforce opportunities. And so you took a fairly novel approach that no one had thought about at the time.
It worked.
Yeah. So you were there for well over a decade in El Paso building, and then you received a call from someone saying, essentially, can you come and repeat the success that you had? And you were content, you were happy having changed, emerged those organizations, built a lot of great success, created jobs. You brought new company in, which brought a new tax base as well. And then you moved to another chamber of commerce. They convinced you that you can have a similar opportunity. They said we have challenges, right? And you went in. You know, the neat thing about the program is as we explore challenges, it made me think of you and what you did. And they brought you in and they specifically told you up front, we have a challenge that we need you to fix. And you weren't afraid to take that on.
Well, you can look at a challenge as either a really bad thing, right, or as a real opportunity.
Right.
I remember meeting with that committee. In fact, you're right. The president of the University of Texas at Arlington called me out of the blue one day. We'd never met. I didn't know who he was.
Right.
His first comment was, we would like to invite you to interview for our chamber presidency. And I said, why? And he was obviously shocked. He said, well, what do you mean, why? I said, you don't know me. I don't know you. Why would you call me out of the blue? He said, well, we've been told you like challenges. I said, great. What's your challenge? He said, are you interviewing me? I said, of course I am. You called me. I didn't call you. And it became evident that they knew they needed to turn a city back around, but they weren't quite sure what the next steps would be. And that did intrigue me. And he described the university as a commuter college. And I asked him why he did. He said, well, that's what it is. And I said, well, it could be a tier 1 research university. Would you consider that if I came to interview? And he said he would. And I came.
Yeah.
And enjoyed my time there very much.
And for our listeners, describe what a tier 1 university is and why that was important for you.
Well, the parameters are very simple. If you think of Silicon Valley today, it's led by 8 tier 1 research universities.
It is.
But once upon a time, it was a rural agricultural region, primarily of fruit orchards, until a guy named George Kosmetsky helped create Stanford Research Institute.
Right.
And I remember finally getting up the nerve after I got to know him. I said, how did you come up with the idea of SRI? And he said, well, it's pretty simple. I was one of the people doing research in the labs, at Stanford. And we realized we needed people who could kind of assess our research and see if it could ever be commercialized. And then we needed people who could help us find venture capital to invest in our concepts and ideas. And then we needed people who could advise us on the legal aspects of, should we seek a patent? Should we form a company? What should we do? And how do we finally go public? And we created SRI to manage that process.
Right.
And it sounds simple when you think of it that way. And yet it took a George Kosmetsky to actually lead the evolution of that. But here's another point about collaboration.
Right.
Silicon Valley didn't emerge simply because of SRI. It emerged because SRI helped spawn 7 other major universities to become tier 1 research universities. It's about the research, the applied research, the opportunity for companies in that region to turn to a university as a research partner,
right,
to continue the evolution of the technologies they need, things of that nature.
Right.
And so it is important that a university, when they look at the role they can play in the community, become a part of the economic engine that's needed.
And being tier 1 gives you access to more research. It gives you credibility as well. And that's a lot of the driver behind bringing in investments into that university, which was just so important. So you bring investments, and then what happens? You have them spawning off businesses, bringing in new businesses who want to be affiliated with the research happening. So it creates another ecosystem within this bigger ecosystem from a workforce development perspective. Right.
Remember, one of those 5 economic developments is access to technology.
Correct. Yep, I served on an advisory board at a university, and we were having to figure out how to commercialize. So we were trying to balance who owns the patent, a lot of the details and logistics that go into that process, but who owns the patents and if the university can still hold it, because a lot of people point to the Gatorade example. And the Gatorade example is you had the researchers and scientists at the University of Florida that created the Gatorade product later on. It was, determining who owned the patent, who would benefit financially from it. But there is a lot of economic development and workforce development that occurs out of those programs. It's interesting to put in context an SRI today and the Stanford today, because back then that infrastructure that we know of as Silicon Valley just didn't exist. And since then, so many places across the country, Research Triangle has been one. We have our own Silicon Valley-ish created and spawned around Texas Instruments in Texas. But so many communities around the country have tried to replicate that success in order to create the economic development piece.
You're right.
Yeah. Now, you went on to lead the Texas Workforce Investment Council as chairman. You were appointed by the governor.
Governor Perry.
Yep. What was the purpose of that group? It's fairly novel. I don't know if most states have a similar program, but I think it'd be worth you telling what it is and what was the purpose.
Well, go back to the 90s again. When I was in El Paso, Congress passed the Workforce Investment Act, and that created our local workforce system, which means every state has a state workforce board.
Right.
Members appointed by the governor. That state workforce board has to develop a strategic plan for whatever their system is in that state. The governor has to approve it, and the Department of Labor has to certify it as falling under the federal legislative guidelines.
Right.
Then in 2014, that legislation was revised and became the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which the acronym is WIOA.
Yes.
And I found that so many times when you say WIOA, people aren't really quite sure what it is.
Right.
They just know you have to qualify for it, but it's really the name of that federal legislation. And so every state has a local workforce board. In Texas, we named ours the Texas Workforce Investment Council. Not sure why, but we did.
Okay.
And in statute, it has two primary responsibilities. One is to lead the development of the statewide system plan. And in Texas, legally, our system is 8 separate state agencies. We have the Texas Workforce Commission, which has oversight of the 28 local workforce boards. We have the Texas Education Agency, the Higher Ed Coordinating Board, Health and Human Services, the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, the Veterans Commission, and Health and Human Services. So those 8 agencies legally comprise our system.
Gotcha.
And the Workforce Investment Council oversees both the plan and its development. And once the governor approves it, then that same group oversees the implementation of that plan with the 8 agencies. Mm-hmm. So that was our role. And still is.
And there's so much that spawns out of not only that council, but there are other similar organizations and councils in the state, not managing the funds, but that are trying to collaborate and partner to make sure that we distribute the funds needed across the state. And to see those, so you said the TWC, the Texas Workforce Commission, and their role in the process, but what role can that group today help to resolve challenges in workforce development from your perspective? Like, how do we continue to move the needle?
Well, it goes back to collaboration.
Yes.
I was in El Paso in the early 90s confronting the loss of the garment industry. I got a knock on my door, which was open, and a man just walked in and said, "You the president?" I said, "I'm told I am." He said, "Man, I got to have your help. I need to meet some farmers and ranchers in a hurry." And I said, "Sir, I don't know who you are. You haven't introduced yourself. I'm not sure why I should help you. Would you mind sitting down and visiting with me a minute?" He said, "I'm sorry. I'm Rick Perry. I'm running for Agriculture Commission." That's how we met.
That's funny.
And he was fascinated at the challenge we faced and the way we were remediating because, among other things, I bought a Levi Strauss building, 100,000 square feet, converted it to office space, put 57 organizations in it, all organizations that could help 28,000 middle-aged, primarily Spanish-speaking women get retrained and reemployed, and in the interim, pay their rent, make their house payment, get access to child care, things like that. Got a $45 million Department of Labor discretionary grant. It was my introduction to the Department of Labor back then, and Within 3 years, we had more than 80% of those women retrained and reemployed. But that was the purpose of that building I bought.
Right.
We managed it, but we had rent revenues to make it sustainable. And those 57 organizations were all in one place so that those women could come into one central location and we could help them through the litany of the organizations within and how they could each provide them with some of the things they were going to need to build a sustainable life again.
Now, Wes, you skimmed over that really quick, but I want to go back to it. So you purchased a 100,000 square foot building. You received a grant of $45 million from the Department of Labor. Walk someone, and that was what,
Early 90s.
Early 90s. And sounds innovative then and would probably still be innovative today. But walk us through more of the detail. How did you come up with that whole premise of buying a building, getting the grant, and then setting the program? I suspect getting that grant wasn't an easy process for you.
Well, it was easier than you might think.
Okay.
But think about, again, what we've talked about. I had 80 organizations collaborating on the plan that was developed for the community over 16 months. They were all bought in.
Right.
And as we worked with DRI and SRI, we understood that we were going to have to find jobs for 28,000 people.
Right.
That meant retraining them for those jobs. But it became an opportunity. As we sold the community externally, I could say, I have 28,000 skilled workers, and I can retrain them for your specific jobs at no cost to you.
Right.
And $45 million sounds like a lot of money until you divide it by 28,000 people. And that meant we had about $1,600 per person,
right,
to help assist. So we had to build a sustainable model. And so we remediated that building, turned it into office space. I rented space to 57 of the 80 organizations that had been on this steering committee, gave them $2 below typical market rate. But that generated enough gross revenue annually that I could operate the building, staff the building. But I did it as an intermediary. Again, it was collaborative governance.
That's amazing.
It was organizations agreeing that the way we would remediate the loss of 28,000 jobs was to work together to ensure that those 28,000 workers got the new training they needed, and they got food stamps, and they got rent,
right,
and they got child care, and they got health care, and all the things you need if you're totally unemployed suddenly. And it was an opportunity to train them for the new jobs we were creating.
Well, but here's what's interesting. I know you said giving $45 million wasn't as hard as I thought, but not only did you help 28,000 people, you helped 28,000 people, their families, and the community, because those people were making an income, making a living, spending that money in the community through restaurants, groceries, etc. And so you saved and impacted much more than 28,000 people. The other piece, though, is that it didn't take you 10 years to figure that out. And that's the part that I find really fascinating. You created a very viable solution. You purchased a building. You had people there. You had all these resources. You had tenants in to make the building viable. And you got the $45 million. But you didn't take 10 years and 50 committees to figure out how to develop that opportunity.
Well, we didn't need that. And I gave them two caveats. I said, you get $2 below market rate if you truly commit to collaborate, right? And the 57 organizations, their head, whether it was a president, a CEO, a chancellor, it didn't matter the title, all had to meet with me once a month as a group.
Nice.
I remember the university president said, well, I'll send my, I said, no. Diana, you must come. Mr. Mayor, you personally will come.
Right.
None of you get to send somebody to represent you. And at the 6-month mark, I said, at the next meeting, I want you to bring me 2 numbers. I want you to go back and tell me what your metrics were the 6 months before we opened this building, whatever you measure.
Right.
You know, the SBA said, well, we measure the number of loans guaranteed and the total amount guaranteed. I said, fine. Give me those numbers for the 6 months before you moved into this building, and give me the numbers since you've been in the building the past 6 months. When they all finished their report out, the worst performing organization had doubled.
Oh, wow.
And the best had quintupled. Wow. And all I ever said to them was, have I shown you that collaborating has helped every one of you more effectively meet and achieve your own goals?
Right. And so, Wes, with the concept of partnerships and collaboration, how would you mentor someone across the country, whether they are an elected official, a Chamber of Commerce CEO, or a nonprofit trying to work in the workforce development space? How would you coach them on how to build that innovation? And I know the term thinking out of the box has been around forever, but you were that person. You thought a little differently. How do you coach someone on that so they can have the kind of success that you had over 30 years ago?
Well, it starts with 3 words. You've got to quit using the I word, as in I did it. You've got to learn to say we did it. And preferably, you've got to learn to say they did it, and I was fortunate to be a part of it.
Right.
Because you cannot build collaboration unless you truly agree that the group that you're trying to get to collaborate comes together and makes collaborative decisions. Right. And you cannot be approaching them and saying, I've decided what we need to do in this community, and I want all of you to help me do it.
Correct.
It's got to be, we need to come together and decide how we're going to build, grow, enhance, support this community, and we'll all have a role in it.
And I hope you don't mind me bringing this up. You mentioned this to me in another conversation, and it makes me think of that collaboration piece. When you merge those 5 different Chamber of Commerce, you mentioned that the leaders of those chambers were resistant, and I think they probably had that I kind of approach, and they wanted to keep it separate and distinct. And the perspective was we needed to merge these so we can generate success. We can generate the outcomes that we desire, and they were resistant. But you brought them on, you gave them a place, you found a home for those organizations as you merged. So your role was to use partnerships in what was probably a kind of complicated situation. But I think you're right. Having someone that gets that they're not as selfish as they're not super selfish, and they're focused on how do I give a little so that we can get more collectively, right? Is kind of what you're describing.
Well, in simple terms, the 5 executive directors wanted to continue being executive directors.
Right.
And they all ended up being 5 vice presidents reporting to me.
Right.
Did not make them happy, but again, the decision to merge wasn't made by me. It was made by the 5 boards of directors.
Right.
They collectively said, we will be more effective as one organization than 5 somewhat competitive organizations. And we'll finally have the bandwidth, the resources, and the ability to focus on what we must do in this community. That was what made it successful.
Right. And in some point in that as well is that as you go through these processes of trying to figure out what's right, sometimes they're tough decisions to make. The idea of getting rid of 5 groups, merging them to one is a really tough decision. And you're not certain if it's going to work. But if everyone is committed to the partnership, then the opportunity for success is huge, right?
Correct.
Tell me about the South Dallas Employment Project, because that's been your latest project in the Redemption Bridge. And you're taking 30 plus years of experience in what you've done working across the country, and you've applying it now into the South Dallas community. How did it start? Why did it start? And what's your goal?
Well, to give you a little background on that, when I came in as chairman of the state system, Governor Perry gave me 2 goals. Yes. He said, number 1, I want you to get those 8 organizations to integrate and align.
Okay.
We legally in Texas have an 8-agency system. In reality, we have 8 stovepipes that don't communicate.
Right.
And it took 2 terms to get the job done. But getting the job done became very simplistic. I inherited a system in which the 8 agency directors and the 14 governors' appointees had weekend retreats they said they were discussing what would be in the plan. It was more like an argument about what got in the plan. Right? So I went back to Governor Perry and said, I want to change the way we build the state plan in Texas. And he said, go ahead. I said, you're going to get flack. He said, it's okay. And I basically told the 8 directors, here's the new planning process. Each of you, without interference by the governor appointees, will build your own plan.
Okay.
You're going to present it to the council. We have to adopt it, but you're going to build your own plan. I only have a few caveats. You personally present the plan, not your staff. I want 3 things in the format. Actionable goals, meaning tell us who will do what by when to achieve that goal.
Right.
Some kind of documentation to show that it's achievable. And finally, because in statute we have to oversee the implementation of your plan, tell us how to measure success, and please don't use words like enhance, improve, or expand. I looked at the head of the State Department of Criminal Justice and said, like reduce recidivism by 10% in 8 years.
Right.
I got a startled look. But it worked. I said, oh, and by the way, all 8 of you will be at all 4 meetings the year we do this. You will all listen to each other's plan. And then I get to come talk to you about your individual plans after you present them.
Interesting.
2 quick anecdotes, because I'm going to describe to you what the South Dallas Employment Project actually is. Right? First, at the end of the year, the 3 men who then led the Workforce Commission, the Education Agency, and the Higher Ed Coordinating Board came to me as a group and said, this has been incredible. We love the process. You probably think just because you let us lead it, but in reality, you made us listen to each other. And we've learned things about each other's agencies we really didn't know. But now we do see the value of how we integrate and align resources. Here's a simple example. The Workforce Commission still does, had incredible dollars for childcare. The Education Agency had money for pre-K. When they combined those 2 funding streams, they could go to daycare centers and enable them to also offer pre-K. Now, working mothers had it both. They had a 12-hour daycare center that also was offering their small children pre-K training. But they came to me and said, would you support us going around the state and sharing our ideas in all the regions in Texas? I said, I will, if you'll do 2 things. Document all the input you get and help me use it to inform the process, because the next step in that was we took their 8 plans and simply integrated them, thereby integrating and aligning the 8 agencies. Well, think of that one topic. We integrated all those agencies. Second, when I went around to see everybody, when I got to Brian Collier, who was then, still is, the head of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, he said, before I explain it to you, can I demystify it? Because I want you to understand how hard my goal is going to be. So I'm pretty sure you didn't just idly say 10% reduction in recidivism over 8 years. Right. I'm going to tell you what's needed. Every year in Texas, and about 1 in 3 working age Texans has a record, we release people from prison. Right. And when they get back to wherever they're going, they need a living wage job quickly, because you're competing with street wages to a significant degree. Right. And if they don't get a legal living wage job, we both know what'll happen, and I'm going to get them back. And then they need a place to live. Some of them have friends and family welcoming them back. A lot don't. Right. And so if they go back to the housing place they came from, chances are, even with the new job, I'll get them back. Right. Let's say you get them the new job, you get them the new place to live. It's Saturday night. What are they going to do? Right. They're not going to sit home alone. Right. So you need to help them reintegrate into the community with a positive peer group influencer, or they're going to go back to the old gang. Right. Well, let's assume you get those 3 solved. Can they get to work every day on time? Can they fight their addiction? We help them fight it while they're in. We can't help them fight it when they're released. What about digital literacy? They can't use a computer in prison. Are they digitally literate for today? And he went through this litany and he said, here's my point. Until we holistically provide training leading to rapid legal employment, supported by all those wraparound services, it's going to be hard to make a really significant reduction in recidivism. Right. Well, I finished my term. I finished my day job. I retired for 6 months. I confess I got bored out of my mind. My wife was encouraging me to find something to do during the week besides stay at home. So I created Redemption Bridge as an intermediary with the idea that we'd develop a model that could be replicated anywhere in the United States. Right. And started in South Dallas because it has some of the biggest challenges in our state. 2 of the zip codes there have the highest incarceration rate of the state. Some of them are among the most poverty-stricken. And I went back to some people I'd worked with before. Michael Hinojosa was then Dallas school superintendent for the 2nd time. And Michael Williams was in the president's office at the University of North Texas. He had been the head of the Texas Education Agency while I was chairman. Oh, okay. I'd worked with Dallas College for years and knew them well, and said, you all were a part of what we did at the state level to integrate and align agencies. Let's see if that model works at a local level. And so they bought in. We created the talent pipeline component. Met a lady at the state fair, a lady named Dr. Francois Booker-Drew, who knew every nonprofit, I think, in the city. She got interested in what we were doing. We had a meeting in February 2020 with 14 organizations, and that's grown now into a collaborative of 238 organizations, all working together to foster a change, a transformation in South, Southern, and now West Dallas.
Right. And so that's pretty neat. I've had a lot of conversations around the wraparound services that a lot of people forget, particularly with people that are reintegrating back into the community. There's that transportation need, the mental health need, and so many other different components. And you're doing that now in South Dallas, which is pretty neat. One item that you mentioned earlier that I think is worth revisiting real quick. I know that we were getting ready to end our program, but it's fascinating that you had those 8 agencies for the state. You required them, the agency heads, to present to you versus their staff. And it's great that you require them to listen to one another, because you can't get a partnership if you don't know what your partners do and what they contribute to the relationship. So I thought that was really neat that you had them get out of their silos and you tried to break that mode of them being compartmentalized and in their silos. It's just I think that alone was just a huge win that a lot of states need to figure out, and a lot of communities, how to partner across boundaries and get out of those silos.
But don't forget that they came to me at the end of that year and said, would you support us working together? That actually led to the tri-agency partnership in Texas that Governor Abbott then signed.
Right.
But it was, again, driven collectively by the agency leaders, just because they listened to each other, just because they could see for themselves that it was in their own best interest to think about how they could integrate and align. Again, you can't implement a plan if people don't agree with the plan.
Right.
And they don't tend to agree with it if they didn't help create it.
Correct. Now, for those listening to the Build America podcast, I encourage you to go look up the South Dallas Employment Project, because I think it could be a great inspiration as teams across the country try to figure out what they're doing and how to succeed. Last thing I want you to speak about is NAWI. Yeah, tell us what that is and what your effort is to continue this process of workforce development and economic development.
Well, in the early 90s, when NAFTA was being debated, I got deeply involved because we had employed a firm in Washington, Public Strategies, led by a guy named Joe O'Neill. He had been U.S. Senator Lloyd Benson's chief of staff during his tenure as a senior Texas senator, and then when he was appointed Treasury Secretary. He was actually the one that got me in to meet with the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Labor when we got our $45 million grant. But he was deeply involved. President Clinton at the time had hired him to be involved in NAFTA, so I became involved in NAFTA.
Right.
And many people do not know that, well, NAFTA became USMCA trade agreement, correct? But still pretty much the same thing.
Right.
And there is a competitiveness committee component, meaning each of the 3 nations appoints a federal agency, and those 3 agencies meet as the competitiveness committee of the trade agreement. And their role is to recommend to the 3 governments what they can collectively do to foster North American competitiveness. Mm-hmm. And in 2020, about the time we were starting the South Dallas Employment Project, that committee met at the George Bush Institute in Dallas, and I was one of the invitees.
Okay.
About 160 of us, I believe. It was a 2-day meeting. And their premise was North American competitiveness, in our opinion, as 3 agencies, is about strengthening our supply chains and expanding our manufacturing capabilities. And we're looking for ideas about what 3 governments could do to incentivize that.
Right.
And remember, governments do only 2 things well. We set policies, we allocate resources.
Right. Right.
And we don't move quickly. We're like an aircraft carrier. We can't turn on a dime. Right. And out of that conversation, there was agreement that we would do a significant study of the 3 educational training systems in the 3 countries. Based on what that told us, we would make some initial recommendations to the governments, and we would support that by putting together pilot projects in North America that would demonstrate that if you follow our recommendations, we can create the workforce needed, because everybody acknowledged that the unmet demand throughout North America is for people skilled and able to manage supply chains and grow manufacturing.
Right.
And so we're putting together, I became involved in that and was asked to help put together the pilot projects. And so we're finally going to formally launch a few years later this May.
I love it. Congratulations to you on that. For the I Build America listening audience, this has been an incredible experience, Wes, just having you on. You are absolutely the guru in workforce development and business and economic development. So I appreciate you taking time to spend with us on the program.
Happy to do so.
America, keep working hard and let's make every day a great day.
Thank you for listening to the I Build America podcast. Please subscribe, share, and comment, and be sure to join us next time for more insights and inspiring conversations on building a powerful American workforce. I Build America, building workforce success one podcast at a time.